Goat versus fish, goat versus fish. In the beginning, there was goat versus fish. The goat fish. And goat versus fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. There is no alpha or omega. There is no black or white. There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. And goat versus fish. You have many questions, yes? Who is goat versus fish? What is goat versus fish? Why is goat versus fish? But there is only one question. Are you goat or are you fish? Ponder it now. The goat are of the land, the fish are of the sea. The goat have horns and the fish have fins. And the pitiable fence sitter just sits on the fence, choosing neither goat nor fish. Do not be susceptible to the Fencedemic that would consume you. Reject the Fencedemic, and embrace goat versus fish. Embrace goat versus fish. Welcome to the Goat vs. Fish podcast with Goat vs. Fish, the goat fish, the unity and disunity of goat and fish. This is the return of Goat vs. Fish. This is the return of Goat vs. Fish. We did hear, Goat vs. Fish did hear how you wished, how you pleaded for the return of Goat vs. Fish in these fence times. Well, here is Goat vs. Fish. Well, here is Goat vs. Fish. Did you miss Goat vs. Fish? You did miss Goat vs. Fish, and so did Goat vs. Fish. Goat versus fish missed speaking to the one such as you, whether or not you have even chosen goat or fish. You know, goat versus fish, it is all about asking you if you are goat or fish. Goat versus fish used to go to so many convention and go to so many places where the land meets the sea, where it is goat versus fish, and would find you who listen, and would ask you, are you goat or are you fish? And you would say goat or you would say fish, and there would be celebration! There would be celebration! Celebration for goat! Celebration! Celebration for fish! And not so much celebration for the fence sitter, whether it is saying that it is not a goat or a fish, or that it is both goat and fish, or that it is some other thing that is not a goat or a fish, or that it just does not understand or comprehend goat versus fish. You do not have to understand or comprehend goat versus fish to comprehend or understand that you are a goat or a fish. That is why Goat versus Fish is here to tell you that the true versus is goat versus fish, and that you are a goat or a fish, but not to tell you if you are a goat or a fish, just that you are a goat or a fish. And then Goat versus Fish asks you if you are goat or fish, and then you tell Goat versus Fish if you are goat or fish. Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? You who listen to Goat versus Fish podcast with Goat versus Fish. Let us listen now to a message from Goat versus Fish. You know, Goat versus Fish, we heard so many messages from you to Goat versus Fish, and Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish does not always respond to the messages for Goat versus Fish. We wish you to hear your fellow goat and fish, and even a fence sitter, and to ponder the questions of Goat versus Fish, but you know it is Goat versus Fish, and Goat versus Fish will begin responding to your questions and your messages for Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish may not respond to every message for Goat versus Fish. That is just the way of Goat versus Fish. That is just the way of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish may respond to you. Goat versus Fish may not respond to you. But Goat versus Fish is always here for you. And Goat versus Fish is always within you and all around you and in all places. You cannot even hide from Goat versus Fish. You cannot even hide from Goat versus Fish. Well, one versus a fence sitter tried to hide from Goat versus Fish, and Goat versus Fish could not find it. And Goat versus Fish was looking all about for the squeakity fence sitter, and there it was. Then a small one came up to Goat versus Fish and said, "Is this for you? Is this for you?" And it was for Goat versus Fish, because we had to tell that fence sitter that it was still Goat versus Fish. Let us listen to one of the most pleasant messages for Goat versus Fish. We cannot wait to hear what message you have for Goat versus Fish. Let us hear the first new message for Goat versus Fish.
To eat raw. This is Bird versus Bear. This is Bird versus Bear. Bird versus Bear. This is Bird versus Bear right there. It's Bird versus Bear right here. Now listen to me, Goat versus Fish. This is Bird versus Bear. We're going to tell you right now that we do not care that you is doing no Goat versus Fish podcast for no person, because you've been done kicked out of that there Comedy Store Los Angeles, and now it's all about Bird versus Bear. You didn't see that it's Showtime for Bird versus Bear now. You didn't see that on that there, was this on a Comedy Store documentary they got going, official trailer there on the YouTube, where they, Showtime's doing some sort of official documentary on the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Guess who was there? It was Bird versus Bear. Bird versus Bear was there. Bird versus Bear was there, and you wasn't there. You can see Bird versus Bear right there, official in a sense, a little bit. Go for it. You seen in the trailer there. You can see Bird versus Bear in the trailer there at 1 minute 45, 1 minute 44, 1 minute 45. You go see right there on the YouTube. You go see Bird versus Bear, and you see that it ain't Goat versus Fish. It is not Goat versus Fish, but it's Bird versus Bear. It's Bird versus Bear. It's Bird versus Bear. It's Bird. It's Bird versus Bear. It's Bird. It's Bird versus Bear. Not Goat versus Fish. You was dumb. You was stupid. Yeah, you got more followers than Bird versus Bear, but you ain't on no Showtime Goat versus Fish. That's Bird versus Bear. That's on there. So yeah, that's gonna be on that there Sunday. It's gonna be Sunday. What do they call that there? It's gonna be Sunday, October 4th at 10 p.m. Sunday, October 4th, 10 p.m. That's his next versus there. So you better watch it, and you better see that it's Bird versus Bear, not Goat versus Bears. And it's just gonna be Bird versus Bear. You ain't welcome there. You ain't welcome there. Comedy Store welcomes Bird versus Bear. Now shut up. Shut up, Goat versus Fish. This is a Bird versus Bear podcast brought to you by Bird versus Bear. Yeah, follow Bird versus Bear on their Twitter bird there, you know, their social media there. Bird versus Bear.
Fences. How did that false versus of Bird versus Bear even know how to call the Goat versus Fish hotline at 747-221-4830, 747-221-GVF0? Can you believe the false versus on Bird versus Bear calling the Goat versus Fish podcast and claiming that it is the Bird versus Bear podcast when it is Goat versus Fish? The Comedy Store Los Angeles, what have you embraced this false versus of Bird versus Bear to be on this Showtime documentary that should be with Goat versus Fish? If Goat versus Fish even comprehends, can you even understand Bird versus Bear? Goat versus Fish can scarcely comprehend what it is saying, much less Goat versus Fish. Sunday versus October 4th, 10 p.m. Showtime. The Comedy Store documentary. With Bird versus Bear and not Goat versus Fish? Where was Fencesitter Albamani? Where was that Comedy Store Los Angeles Fencesitter Albamani to tell Goat versus Fish to be on the documentary of the Comedy Store Los Angeles Goat versus Fish? You cannot even trust those fence-sitters. You cannot even trust those fence-sitters, can you? No, it called a fellow fence-sitter. It called Bird versus Bear, and Bird versus Bear went to the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Yes, and it was there, and then Goat versus Fish was just what? Goat versus Fish. Look, Goat versus Fish is going now. Goat versus Fish is going now to the YouTube. Goat versus Fish. Yes, YouTube. You can subscribe to Goat versus Fish. We should watch a little bit of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Showtime. Comedy Store. documentary. Let us see these verses. Let us see these verses. The Comedy Store 2020 official trailer Showtime documentary series, Goat vs. Fish. It's amazing to be back at the Comedy Store.
My boyfriend tried to talk about that joke. He came up to me and was like, I don't like that joke. I was like, well, a little awkward. It's not about you.
Ha ha ha. It is a joke. It is a joke. It is a joke. Is your boyfriend goat or fish? Let us go ahead to the verses. Let us go ahead to the verses. Let us go ahead to the verses. 140. Let us see. Let us see here. It is coming up on Goat versus Fish. It is coming up on Goat versus Fish. 144. 1 minute 44. It should be Goat versus Fish. False verses! False verses! False verses! False verses! False verses! This is false verses! Comedy Store documentary is false verses with Bird versus Bear. Goat versus Fish, Goat versus Fish. It was just for barely a verses, but Goat versus Fish saw Bird versus Bear just there, just there. That fence-headed Bird versus Bear. Stealing the verses from Goat versus Fish. Do not witness the Comedy Store official trailer. Do not witness the Comedy Store documentary on Showtime on October 4th at 10 p.m. Do not do it. Do not do it. But if you do it, just make sure that perhaps it is not actually Goat versus Fish. Just make sure perhaps there is some Goat versus Fish. Perhaps there is some Goat versus Fish. We do not even know if Bird versus Bear, the false versus a Bird versus Bear, is going to be there. We just saw it in the trailer for the verses. We just saw it in the trailer for the verses. Will it be there? We do not even know. We do not even know. We suspect not. Why would Showtime, if it wishes to show time, why would it not show Goat versus Fish? Why would it even show Bird versus Bear? Perhaps it is some sort of comedic deception. It is some sort of deception that they wish you to... This is enough false verses. This is enough false verses. Bird versus Bear, do not call Goat versus Fish. We do not want to hear your false verses. We suspect you will not even be in the documentation of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, which is a place of Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish would go there now, but there is a Fencedemic, and that is not very Goat versus Fish. The Fencedemic is not very Goat versus Fish. It is fences all around us. It is fences all around us. But it is still Goat versus Fish. But it is still Goat versus Fish. Now, let us listen to an ancient message for Goat versus Fish. An ancient message for Goat versus Fish. You know. Before the fence times, it was so Goat versus Fish. It was so Goat versus Fish. And many did call and leave a message for Goat versus Fish. Secret messages for Goat versus Fish. You have not even heard from Goat versus Fish. Let us go now to Before the Fence Times and hear a message for Goat versus Fish. Let us see Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Sign in to Goat versus Fish. Yes, 747-221-4830. Yes. Dashboard for Goat versus Fish. Let us see. Yes, we wish to see. We wish to see call handling, voicemail, and alerts. Where is the voicemail for Goat versus Fish? Where is the voicemail for Goat versus Fish? Activation, yes. Activity, yes. Voicemail for Goat versus Fish. Yes, load more verses, load more verses, load more verses, load more verses, load all the verses. Load all the verses. Load more verses. Here are the verses. Here are the verses. Goat versus Fish. Load more verses. We want to get before the fence times. Load more verses. Load more verses. Load more verses. Load more verses. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. 4/13/2020. 4/13/2020. That was already fence times. That was already fence times. That was already fence times. You mean to say you have deleted the previous verses of Goat versus Fish? The messages from before the fence times can no longer be accessed by Goat versus Fish? Line 2, what is with you? What is with you? You did not tell Goat versus Fish you would be deleting the verses for Goat versus Fish. We have messages, we have important messages for Goat versus Fish, and you have just removed them without the permission of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish did not give you permission to remove the messages for Goat versus Fish. Those were precious verses to Goat versus Fish. Each and every verses was a precious verses to Goat versus Fish. Even from the fence sitter, even the messages from the fence sitter, and especially from the goat and fish. Deletion, negation, fence times, Otis, fence times, Otis, fence times. Line 2. Very fancy, very offensive to Goat versus Fish. We shall send a message. We shall send a message to line 2. We shall communication with line 2. And we shall say to you, release the messages, release the unheard messages of Goat versus Fish. And are you goat or fish, line 2? Are you goat or are you fish? Goat versus Fish. We suppose you cannot hear from before the fence times. Now we are just in the fence times. We are in the fence times. Well, so long as we are in the fence times, let us talk about the fence. Let us talk about the fence. You do not suppose that Goat versus Fish could just ignore the fence? No, we do not ignore the fence. We confront the fence. We confront the fence. We confront the fence sitter. If you catch the Fencedemic, it is very dangerous to a goat or a fish. You may have already chosen goat or fish. You who listen. Have you chosen goat or fish? Perhaps you are a fish. Perhaps you are a goat. Perhaps you are versus the fish. Perhaps you are versus the goat. If you catch Fencedemic, and it is very contagion, says Goat versus Fish. If you catch the Fencedemic, your ponderer will become addled, and you will no longer remember your answer to the one true question. If you are a goat, you may begin to think you are fish. If you are a fish, you may be thinking to pretend that you are a goat. The Fencedemic confuses you. It makes you think that perhaps there was never Goat versus Fish. You catch the Fencedemic and you wonder, is there Goat versus Fish? You start to ask false questions such as, why goat or fish? And why can I not be some other fancy verses? Like a Dargon or a Humanitarian or some sort of false verses as this. You may look around you and you say, I do not see anyone with Fencedemic. All I see are goat and fish. And celebration that you see the goat and fish. Yes, we want you to see the goat and fish, for everything is goat versus fish, and all things are goat or fish. But just because you do not see the Fencedemic, it is all around you. It is all around us. And if you become infection with Fencedemic, you may not even be able to recognize yourself, much less goat versus fish. But there are those who deny the Fencedemic. There are those who deny the very fenciness that has spread to every corner of the universe. Never gonna choose a goat, never gonna choose a fish, never gonna choose a goat or fish. Never gonna choose a goat, never gonna choose a fish, never gonna choose a goat or fish. Goat versus Fish. Excuse Goat versus Fish. Just had a fence there in the throat of Goat versus Fish. Now, Goat versus Fish was saying to you, yes, there are those who deny the Fencedemic. They say there is no fence. They say there is no fence. They say there is no Goat versus Fish. Or perhaps they say there is only a fence. There is only a fence, and there is not Goat versus Fish because Goat versus Fish is a fence sitter. The fence sitter, they have all sorts of fancy verses. You need not pay them any verses, but you do need to pay a verses to the Fencedemic, because the Fencedemic is coming for you. It is coming for you. It might be coming for Goat versus Fish, but we are Goat versus Fish. And we have the mask of Goat versus Fish, protection from Fencedemic with the mask of Goat versus Fish, You can find these things and more at goatversusfish.com/store. The mask of Goat versus Fish to protect yourself from fenciness. It is the Fencedemic! I need protection from Goat versus Fish! The mask of Goat versus Fish. The mask of Goat versus Fish projects Goat versus Fish out to the universe, and it gives you protection from Fencedemic. It is the mask of Goat versus Fish. There are those who would deny the very Fencedemic. And those who deny the Fencedemic, or perhaps they accept that it is a Fencedemic, but that it is not such a serious fence, they say. Oh, it is not such a great offense. Oh, yes, you catch a bit of Fencedemic, and you still know if you are a goat or a fish, or have you seen a goat or fish? Probably all goat and fish are secretly fence-sitters with the Fencedemic, yes, and they are still goat and fish, so why do I need protection? Why do I need the mask of Goat versus Fish? They may say to you. The fence-sitter may say to you. And of course we know the fence-sitter. We know the fence-sitter. Ronald D. Tump, Precedent Ronald D. Tump, Goat versus Fish, on the Twitterver, has said, at real Donald Trump, are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? So many verses. Are you goat or fish? Goat versus Fish has asked real Donald Trump, and it has never responded to Goat versus Fish. It is tweeting about all the verses, but never responding to Goat versus Fish. Very offensive to Goat versus Fish. And it wishes to build a fence. It is always saying, build the fence, and it keeps building a fence, but it is not really building so much of a fence, and it is calling it a wall, and it divides the goat from the goat, so they cannot versus the fish, and it has Fencedemic. Real Donald Trump said that it has received Fencedemic. This is somewhat humorous to Goat versus Fish. It is only humorous to Goat versus Fish because it so strongly denies the seriousness of the fence on which it sits. This is so very fancy. This is classic fence-sitter. If a fence-sitter can be called a classic versus, because, you know, the only classic versus is really Goat versus Fish. But the fence-sitter who would build the fence, who would sit upon the fence and never choose Goat or Fish, it has the Fencedemic itself. Fence-sitter. Deny the Fencedemic and receive the Fencedemic. Deny the Fencedemic and receive the Fencedemic. You already have it. If you cannot choose Goat or Fish, you may have Fencedemic already. You may already have it. You may be spreading it to other fence-sitters. You may be spreading it to Goat or Fish. Perfectly versus Goat or Fish that receive Fencedemic and then do not know if they're Goat or Fish, and then they end. Hundreds of thousands of goat and fish have been ended for lack of choosing Goat or Fish, for not remembering if they are Goat or Fish. The precedent is Goat versus Fish. Ronald Trump, we know that you have your differences with Goat versus Fish. We know that you see yourself as different from Goat versus Fish. We know you like to sit on the fence above the verses and say all your fenciness, but Goat versus Fish forgives you. Goat versus Fish loves you. Goat versus Fish is here for you. And it is not too late. It is not too late for you to choose Goat or Fish. Save yourself from the fence and choose Goat or Fish, Ronald D. Tump. Save yourself from the fenciness. Before it is too late for you. Real Donald Trump, are you Goat or Fish? Answer Goat versus Fish. And save yourself from the Fencedemic. With the power of Goat versus Fish, you can save yourself from Fencedemic. Goat versus Fish versus Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish has been versing on a few celebrations to give to you the goat and fish. Let us see some of those celebrations now. Goat versus Fish. Fish are versus the goat. Goat are versus all the fish. Fish are versus the goat. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat and fish. Don't sit on the fence. Goat versus fish, fish versus goat. Well, the goat are versus the fish, and the fish are versus the goat. The goat and the fish, goat and the fish, goat and the fish, goat versus fish. Well, the fish are versus the goat, and goat are versus the fish. The goat and the fish, goat and the fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, and the goat are versus all the fish. The fish are versus goat, and the goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, and the goat are versus all the fish. The fish are versus goat, and the goat versus fish. Goat fish. The goat are versus all the little fishy fishes. The fish are versus goat. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. And the fish are versus all the goat. The goat are versus fish. Well, you get the verses. You get the verses. It is a super versus of goat versus fish. It is a super versus of goat and fish. You can play as goat. You can play as fish. Question. Budding. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? That is the question. That is the question. If you have a celebration of goat versus fish, it can be one that you sing to goat versus fish, or you can play it upon instrumentation to goat versus fish, or it can be a scribbling or a drawing or a painting of goat versus fish, or of a goat or of a fish, or even of a fence. And you can send all of these celebrations. These are all celebration, the celebration of creation of goat versus fish. You create goat versus fish. You create goat versus fish. Shouting out now to Lucid Napoleon Doom Goat, to Lucid Nap, to Creeping Wave Radiation, Creeping Wave Radio. Yes, are they all the same verses? They all seem to be goat versus fish. Yes, Goat versus Fish is going to appear on that verses, and they created the Fool of Goat versus Fish. They made a Fool of Goat versus Fish. They made a tarot deck versus that had Goat versus Fish. It was the Fool of Goat versus Fish. Yes, it is an amazing verses, and if you make a celebration for Goat versus Fish, or some sort of paintmentation for goat versus fish, or whatever the verse is, then you can send it to GoatVsFish at GoatVsFish.com, GoatVsFish at GoatVsFish.com, and you can send it with a message for Goat versus Fish, and then Goat versus Fish will share your verses on the Twitterver and the Instagram and the YouTube, or whatever the verse is that Goat versus Fish wishes to spread your verses, or perhaps Goat versus Fish will put it on the Goat vs. Fish podcast. Yes, to share with all who listen to Goat vs. Fish. Send your celebrations to Goat vs. Fish. Send your celebrations to Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish needs to bring you the verses. Goat vs. Fish needs to bring you the verses, but there are so many verses to bring you that are all Goat vs. Fish. This versus Goat vs. Fish has spoken to you about Ronald D. Tump the fence sitter and how it caught Fencedemic. Yes, this is the verses you are all pondering and wondering, what does Goat vs. Fish have to say about this verses? Yes, there is even the question of if Biden versus Trump is Goat vs. Fish, or if it is Fish versus Goat, or if it is all fences. Yes, we will have to look at this verses. We know that the band Fish endorsed Sandy Bernard, which is very fish, but it seems that the one called Sandy Bernard did not triumph, and that now it is some verses of Trident versus Bump, and we will have to see if it is actually Goat versus Fish, or if it is just another false political verses that consumes you, that you should realize is actually Goat versus Fish. But in any verses, let us just look at some of the verses. Some of these are old verses. They may be old verses. You may have said to yourself, oh, I wonder what Goat vs. Fish has to say about salmon cannon. Salmon cannon. Wow, it is a cannon that shoots the salmon over the fence, or is it under the fence, or over the fence? It is over the fence, and then the salmon rejoins the sea of the fish. It is some sort of fence avoidance versus, but salmon cannon. What does Goat vs. Fish have to say about the salmon cannon? Clearly it is fish, but beyond that versus, well, we will just have to ponder it. 112-year-old fish has broken longevity record. Wow, 112 years of fish. 112 years of fish. Yes, 112 more years of fish. 112 more years of fish, and perhaps 112 years of goat. Two verses the fish. Let us see. Other verses. Smile for goats. Smile for goats. What is smile for goats? Smile for goats. We will have to look at that verses. Let us see. Goat versus fish. Attractive chicken. mymodernmet.com/different types of chicken photo book. Attractive chicken. Goat versus fish scarcely believes that there is an attractive chicken. If it was even an unattractive fence sitter, it would not be more attractive than a goat or a fish. Even the most unattractive goat or fish is more attractive than the most attractive chicken that sits on the fence choosing neither goat nor fish. There is no chicken. There is no chicken. Eagle versus octopus. False verses, but vice. The V of the vice should be the V of the verses of goat versus fish, and yet eagle versus octopus. Goat versus fish. Fenciness. Bird god. Fenciness. Ravenous wild goat ruled an island. Apple News. Ravenous wild goat ruled an island. That is a goat versus. That is a goat versus. Goat versus fish wants to know, how did it triumph all the fish? So it could rule goat island. Yes. Sharks that walk. Duck versus locust. False versus brutalist sand castles. Some sort of where the land meets the sea, and it is a creation of where it is that it is especially goat versus fish. And V-shaped plane. Versus bird-on-bird violence. Oh, the fence-sitters getting into it with one another, yes. Goat versus fish. Goat breaks through fence. Goat breaks through fence. CBS, Northern California, May 13th. Goat breaks through fence celebration. Cat versus dot, no. Rats eating rats, no. Cops are pigs. Interesting verses. Is a cop a goat or a fish? Is a cop a goat or a fish? Is a pig a goat or a fish? We do not know. We do not know. But there are some who say it. There are some who say it. That was said just now by Goat versus Fish when Goat versus Fish was communication to you. There are so many verses here. There are so many verses. And we will tell you the verses. Goat versus Fish will bring you the verses. And if you have some verses that Goat versus Fish should read or ponder and commentation, you can send it to Goat versus Fish. Again, the verses, they come from within you. Goat versus Fish has said this to all the goat and fish. Goat and fish. Are you goat or fish? Goat or fish? Send the verses that you want commentation at Goat versus Fish on the Twitterver at GoatVsFish or on the Instantgram for all to see at GoatVsFish, or you can send it to GoatVsFish at GoatVsFish.com. You can email Goat versus Fish at GoatVsFish.com. This is not a false verses. This is a true verses. GoatVsFish at GoatVsFish.com. And you can go to GoatVsFish.com. Send a message to Goat versus Fish and say, Goat versus Fish, you should do this commentation. Goat versus Fish may accept your verses. Goat versus Fish may reject your verses. Harsh rejection from Goat versus Fish. But we still love you and celebration. Where is Goat versus Fish? Where is Goat versus Fish? Goat versus Fish may have not been here on the Goat versus Fish podcast that is always Goat versus Fish, but there has been Goat versus Fish. you can listen to Goat vs. Fish and maybe even witness a little bit of Goat vs. Fish on Bootleg Fish Center Live. You may say, Fish Center Live? Wow, that sounds very fish. That sounds like the Adult Swim streams of Fish Center Live, Goat vs. Fish with Goat vs. Fish. It is Goat vs. Fish Center Live. It is called Bootleg Fish Center Live. It is almost Adult Swim. It is on the YouTube. Versus 26. Bootleg Fish Center Live versus 21. Yes, and both of the recent intercession, you can hear Goat vs. Fish on Bootleg Fish Center Live. Adult Swim, recognize Goat vs. Fish. Adult Swim, accept Goat vs. Fish. True versus Goat vs. Fish does sometimes calling into Fish Center Live on the adultswim.com/streams. Adult Swim is becoming Goat vs. Fish. It is becoming Goat vs. Fish. And you should watch the Adult Swim streams at adultswim.com/streams. And you should go in the chat and demand Goat vs. Fish and ask if they are goat or fish and just say Goat vs. Fish. Episode 29 of No One Right Way Pod. It is called No One Right Way. It is with Dub and Rich. Yes. Are they goat? Are they fish? You will have to listen. If Real Rich and Dub B are goat or fish. It is called No One Right Way Pod. But of course you know the right way is Goat vs. Fish. And you know the left way is Goat vs. Fish. And you know there is no right or left. There is only goat and fish. But it is called No One Right Way Pod, episode 29 with Goat vs. Fish. You should listen to Goat vs. Fish. It is really just another Goat vs. Fish podcast that Goat vs. Fish went to the No One Right Way Pod and made it Goat vs. Fish. So it is like a bonus versus of the Goat vs. Fish podcast that you have not even listened, and it is Goat vs. Fish. Bootleg Fish Center Live celebration. No One Right Way Pod celebration. Yes, go, and hear bonus Goat vs. Fish. Hear Goat vs. Fish. And if you want to see a Zoom show of Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish is going to be on a show with Goat vs. Fish. Yes, when is the show with Goat vs. Fish? When is the show with Goat vs. Fish? Let us look at the verses. Show up, go up. L.A. Attack of the Comedy Show. Saturday, October 17th, 2020. Featuring the comedy of Eric Marino, who was on Goat vs. Fish podcast number 25, and Kristen Lundberg also was on Goat vs. Fish. Kristen Lundberg also on Goat vs. Fish podcast. Yes, and there is Amanda Cohen, who was on the Goat vs. Fish podcast. It was an early Goat vs. Fish podcast at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. That was for the verses of Goatfish, On the first verse of Goatfish, the goatfish gave to me a goat versus the fish. And there was Alba Money Fence Sitter. Yes, that will be on the verses with Goat versus Fish. Yes, there will be Goat versus Fish. And Mia Mars also has been not twice but thrice on the Goat vs. Fish podcast, has left messages for Goat vs. Fish. What we are trying to tell you is that it is Goat vs. Fish. Yes, Attack of the Comedy Show, Saturday, October 17th. Look for Show Up, Go Up, LA. Show Up, Go Up, LA on the Instagram and the Twitterver. And looking for Show Up, Go Up on the Book of Faces. And like Goat vs. Fish on the Book of Faces, facebook.com/GoatVsFish, and you can watch the show, and you can witness Goat vs. Fish right there through your monitor. You can see Goat vs. Fish, and you can commentation and say, more Goat vs. Fish. That is where you can behold the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Well, that is the verses of Goat vs. Fish. That is the verses of Goat vs. Fish. But we want you to know, that you have heard a verses so profound, and you want Goat vs. Fish to stick around. With the sticker of Goat vs. Fish, the vinyl verses is thick and strong. It sticks around for oh so long. With the sticker of Goat vs. Fish, the sticker of Goat vs. Fish. You can stick it wherever you wish, and the stick on which becomes Goat vs. Fish becomes Goat vs. Fish. And you can find these things and more at goatvsfish.com/store. And if you are a goat, you can patch things up with fish. And if you are a fish, you can patch things up with goat with the patch of Goat vs. Fish. With the patch of Goat vs. Fish. Stitch by stitch by stitch by stitch, it is Goat vs. Fish. It is Goat vs. Fish. You can iron or you can sew. You verses as you go. You verses as you go. Stitch by stitch by stitch by stitch, it is Goat vs. Fish. It is Goat vs. Fish. Without Goat vs. Fish, you surely hurt, and that is why you need the Goat vs. Fish shirt with the shirt of Goat vs. Fish. It says Goat vs. Fish, it says Goat vs. Fish. And you can find these things and more at goatvsfish.com/store. And Goat vs. Fish told this to you before with the mask of Goat vs. Fish. The mask of Goat vs. Fish to protect yourself from Fencedemic. Protect yourself from the Fencedemic with the mask of Goat vs. Fish. You can order the mask of Goat vs. Fish on the line now with Goat vs. Fish at goatvsfish.com/store. You can find these things and more at goatvsfish.com/store. And if you want nothing from Goat vs. Fish, but you want to send a verses to Goat vs. Fish, the Venmo at Goat vs. Fish. The V of the Venmo is the V of the verses for Goat vs. Fish. The Venmo at Goat vs. Fish, at GoatVsFish, at GoatVsFish. Send a verses or 2 or 6 to Goat vs. Fish, to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration. 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 Now follow Goat vs. Fish on the Instagram if you wish, and follow Goat vs. Fish on the Twitter and the Book of Faces, in all the social media places, on the YouTube and even the Twitch, and even the Twitch, and even the Twitch where it is Goat vs. Fish. On Twitch it shall be Goat vs. Fish, where the Julian humdinger and forgotten virtuous fence-sitters welcome Goat vs. Fish. Even though they are fancy, it is the Twitch, and Goat vs. Fish must spread the verses, must spread the verses. Perhaps we can use these fence-sitters. Perhaps we can use these fence-sitters to spread the verses of Goat vs. Fish. To spread the verses of Goat vs. Fish. To spread the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Subscribe to the Goat vs. Fish podcast and share with all you know, so Goat vs. Fish can grow. And ask one you know, are you goat or fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Their answer may surprise you. Their answer may surprise you. Or perhaps you already know if they are a goat or a fish. But do you? Ask ones you know if they are goat or fish. Tell them to follow Goat vs. Fish. Tell them to listen to Goat vs. Fish. To Goat vs. Fish. 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 You never know when it is going to be a classic celebration of Goat vs. Fish. And once more for the verses. Once more for the verses. On Showtime. If you wish to witness Bird vs. Bear, so you can see it in all its fanciness and see how it is not nearly so special as Goat vs. Fish and not nearly so pleasant as Goat vs. Fish, and really how it is just trying to be Goat vs. Fish and failing fancily to be Goat vs. Fish. Showtime, 5-part series, Sunday, 10 p.m. The Comedy Store documentary. Will you see that fence-sitter bird versus bear in the first verses, or in the third or the fifth verses of the Comedy Store documentation that should have been Goat versus Fish? We do not know. We do not know. But if you go to the YouTube and if you search for the trailer for the Comedy Store Los Angeles documentation of Showtime, you will see that fence-headed bird versus bear. Do not follow Bird vs. Bear at BirdVsBear on the social media. It is not even worth telling you not to do it, because you won't, because it is a false versus and you would rather follow Goat vs. Fish. But if you do choose to follow Bird vs. Bear, yes, do not tell it that actually you follow Goat vs. Fish and you follow Bird vs. Bear, and then you look at its fenciness and then you send a message, secret message to Goat vs. Fish. And you tell it all about the fenciness of Bird vs. Bear. So in that versus, Goat vs. Fish knows what fences that it is up to, and then Goat vs. Fish can get to the versus before Bird vs. Bear, and it can be Goat vs. Fish! This has been a versus of Goat vs. Fish. This has been a versus of Goat vs. Fish! Shout out to Elliot's Deutsch big band Goat, the pandemonium big band that brings this celebration of Goat vs. Fish. And it was written,